Hey, this is James here with the Oracle Outlook for the week starting January the 21st, 2019. Before getting into this week's video reading, I just want to take a moment to thank those of you who tuned into last week's video reading. In last week's video reading, I worked with Lenormand and Tarot combined. I did that to honor the request of a viewer, and I was pleasantly surprised to see how well that experiment was received. I got a number of views, I got a number of likes. Thank you for watching and thank you for liking. And I also got a number of comments. I got a number of comments in particular from those of you who said that you would be willing to give combining Lenormand and Tarot a go. So I was very excited to hear that. And so at some point, for those of you who said you'd be willing to do that, circle back around and let me know how you are progressing and making developments with the combination of the two systems. I would love to hear all about it. So I also would like to give thanks to that viewer who made the request. I was very comforted to hear how the reading resonated with this particular viewer. The person got back to me and said, in a way, it was almost like I was reading for them specifically. And I just think that is a wonderful way for the universe to work, because how interesting is it that the person who made the request is the person who had the reading resonate with them the most. So I just love that. So that was nice to hear. So thank you for the confirmation and the validation for that reading. And so this reading is also going to be a viewer requested video. So over the course of the last week, in addition to the comments that I got about working with Lenormand and Tarot, a number of you asked me about my videos pertaining to playing cards. So some people asked me about my viewer requested video series on my personal study and practice of cartomancy. And so over the course of the week, I uploaded the latest installment of the series. So if you haven't checked that out and you'd like to, I will leave a link to that in the viewer description box below. So you could check that out. And someone in particular asked me if I would be willing to work with playing cards for the Oracle Outlook. So I've done that in the past with using different playing card decks. And so I was very inspired and motivated because of all the interest and all the questions I got around playing cards this week. So the deck that I'm going to be working with is called the Origins, Shadows of History playing cards. They are by Rick Davidson. And so you know there's always a story that goes with deck selection. So in this particular case, I went to bed late one evening and I had playing cards on my mind because in part of all the interest that I was getting around it and because I was working on the video at the same time. And so this particular deck came to mind and I couldn't shake it. Once it got in my brain, it kind of just held itself there. It got to the point where after kind of tossing and turning for like an hour with this deck on my mind, I had to get up, I had to grab the deck, I had to play with the deck for a little while, so I did a couple of readings on the floor in my bedroom, which is where I do my personal readings. And then after I felt like I got that out of my system, I got in bed and went right to sleep. But that told me on some level that the deck really wants to work with me more. It wants to have some activity around it. So since then, I've been holding it, I've been playing with it, I've been doing daily draws with it, and for me a daily draw consists of 3 cards. And I just basically ask the question, what do I need to know about my day? What will happen in my day? How's my day going to go? Those kinds of things. And if I felt inclined, because of something that I'm watching on TV, usually a current event type situation, I may pose that to the cards just for some clarity or some insight or some guidance, that kind of thing. Or if I really want to see a prediction being made, you know, if I'm going to make a prediction, and I use the cards for that. So I did that a lot with this particular deck. But I also thought that because I'm immersing myself with this deck, it would be a nice deck to use for this week's Oracle Outlook. So again, we are working with the Origins, Shadows of History playing cards by Rick Davidson. Another interesting thing to note about this deck, in light of my work with Tarot de Marseille, is that Rick Davidson, the creator of the deck, was inspired by a deck of cards that was created in France in 1567. And that is a little bit right before the time that Tarot de Marseille became really big in France. So there is a little slight historical connection there. right? So that was another reason that I was like, oh, this is interesting that this deck wants to work with me at this particular point in time. There are no accidents, right? So again, working with the Origins, Shadows of History by Rick Davidson. I will be leaving a link to Rick Davidson's site in the description box below in case you want to learn more about the deck, or if because it's inspired by history and considered to some degree, it may be a more modern historical reproduction and you want to add it to your collection, you can go ahead and learn more about how you can make that happen. So now that I've talked about inspirations for this week's video and I talked about the deck, let's now move to the table and take a closer look at the cards that are going to make up this week's Oracle Outlook. And here we are with the cards on the table. I'm going to take the deck in hand. I'm going to take a few moments to shuffle the cards. And as I shuffle, I'm focusing on my usual intention and question for these weekly general readings. And that is, I'm asking for the insight and the guidance and the information that will be most helpful to us as we move through the upcoming week. Alright, I'm going to go ahead now and cut the cards. Now I'm going to spread them out in the fan. And now I'm going to pick 5 cards from the fan that are getting my attention. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now I'm taking the remainder of the deck up and put that to one side. And now I'm going to line up the cards. All right. And now I'm going to read the cards from left to right. So now starting with the card on the far left, starting to line off, we have, okay, so here we have the 7 of Hearts. So starting the line off, we have a situation possibly that has to do with our feelings, our emotional nature, because Hearts for me represents emotions and feelings, or something having to do with a relationship in particular, because this is the suit of relationships and love. So there may be something along those lines, or something having to do with healing. So since those are the possibilities, let's take a look at what this particular card might mean. For me, when it comes up, it represents, I call it the second time around card. So there may be something having to do with, something coming back up in our lives for the second time, or that in a particular relationship, it may be about being willing to give somebody another chance, going with the idea about second chances, right? Or it could be that you may be seeking the opportunity for somebody else to give you another chance. So either way, it could either be second chance for someone else, or that you are seeking a second chance from another person. But this card for me can represent the second time around and second chances. Now, since I talked about the idea about the second time around, this may be an idea for some of us, because I'm looking at the number 7, and for me the number 7 represents spirituality. So in a spiritual context, this may be a nod for us to be taking a look at signs and synchronicities, things that happen in patterns, the idea of something recurring. So there may be something of that. So pay attention, because the universe may be speaking to you through signs and synchronicities this week, right? So there is that. Now, if I'm talking about the idea here about the second time around or second chances, the 7 is also a number that represents improvement, right? So there may be on an emotional level or in relationships where we are seeking to improve a particular relationship, if we're not talking about, just emotional improvement across the board, right? So that would make sense if we're wanting to improve a relationship, being willing to extend somebody the courtesy of a second chance, right? So there is that to consider. For some people, bringing this back to the spiritual aspect of the number 7, and I talked about hearts being about healing, this card for me can represent spiritual healing. So somebody may be moving into an experience in which that will play a huge part, maybe in their own spiritual practice or their spiritual development, because the number 7 also represents self-improvement and self-awareness. So for some people, this could be a matter of pursuing spiritual healing, as part of their own personal or spiritual growth and development. So again, the 7 of Hearts can represent a surprise. It can represent the second time around or a second chance, something having to do with improving relationships. It could also be, since I'm saying that, we may be moving into a space, if we've been feeling challenged on an emotional level, this could signal an opportunity that's going to allow us to feel better, because again, this would be improvement on an emotional level. So it makes me feel like the idea of feeling better, right? And then somebody may be pursuing something having to do with spiritual healing. So there may be a spiritual healing modality. Like for me, I tend to think of Reiki when this card comes up, because I'm a Reiki practitioner, but there are different forms and methods and modalities around spiritual healing. So it could just be a matter of maybe exploring those if you feel inclined to do that. So that for me is the 7 of Hearts. Moving to the next card. Oh, look at this. We have an interesting progression here. So we have an increase on something having to do with our feelings and emotions, because we went from the 7 of Hearts to now the 8 of Hearts, right? So for me, the 8 of Hearts can represent, if we go with the idea this is talking about improving our relationship, or the second time around, or second chances in a relationship, this card talks about a loved one. So there may be something having to do with a romantic or a love relationship that we're seeking some improvement around, because this card can represent a loved one, like I said. It can also represent a very good friend. So there may be something about improving a relationship with a very good friend that we are putting some attention towards. If you are working on your own spiritual growth and development, for me, then this card can represent working with your guardian angel. For me, this is a guardian angel card, right? And if you're not into angels, you may not be, then it would be anyone who is on your quote-unquote spirit team that is working to watch over you and protect you. So in that instance, it could also be a reference to a spirit guide if you don't particularly work with angels, right? But it would be the sense of feeling like I'm being watched over and protected. Now, another thing here would be in certain relationships that we're talking about improving them, then this is about having mutual love and admiration, but also about mutual faith and trust in each other, right? The faith and the trust has to be mutual, and that may be what we need to work on repairing. Somebody may have had trust issues, and so we're working on that. But it's nice because we're seeing, again, the progression. There's an intensity here when we see the same suit cards in consecutive order or sequential order. And so this is an increase. We're moving towards wrapping that up, right? The higher the number, the closer towards completion on a certain level we're getting with that. So again, the 8 of Hearts for me can represent a very good friend, a loved one, a guardian angel, that kind of energy. But it's talking about this idea about having mutual love and admiration, and also mutual faith and trust. So now let's take a look at the middle card. Okay. So now here we have the middle card, and for me, I always look at the middle card as the central issue and something that we're putting some focus and attention on. If we go with the idea that the first 2 cards are talking about improving a relationship either with a loved one or a very good friend, then this card would explain why. Sometimes for me, this card can represent small difficulties, so that would make sense if we're having to give another person a second chance. So this card can represent small difficulties, but also this is an argument card. So there may have been an argument, and if there wasn't, then we're being asked to pay very close attention to the words that we use in conversations with other people, because we want to minimize the potential for arguments, right? But for me, this card could say too, like the reason why we're wanting to improve a relationship either with a loved one or a very good friend is because there was some argument. And so now we're having to put some work or effort into improving that. If you notice, we have the 7 repeating twice, right? And if we go with the idea that the theme of the 7 is about improving something, then this card would suggest that there's going to be some work or effort into improving that situation, right? And this is why, because the 7 of clubs for me can represent hard work. This is about rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty and doing the work. This is hard work, putting your nose to the grindstone, that kind of energy. But if we're talking about relationships with hearts coming before it, then this would be a possibility of some sort of small difficulty. And you may have to say, because I'm looking at the order of the cards, if we're having to have a conversation, then it may say in the grand scheme of things, that thing that you had the argument about or the thing that was causing a problem may not be as big as we want to make it. Again, going with the idea about small difficulties, right? But here it's making me feel like we're going to be putting some work or effort into improving a situation, right? And so again, if we haven't had the argument already and working to repair that, then we may be just being given a heads up for how we choose to communicate to other people this week so we don't run the risk of getting into an argument. So that is how I would look at the 7 of clubs. Now let's move on to the next card. And here we have, So here we have the Jack of Hearts. And so do you see a pattern here? 3 out of the 4 cards this week are from the suit of hearts. So there's something having to do with our feelings, our emotions, and relationships. This week, there may be something having to do with healing a particular relationship or healing something on an emotional level, right? And putting the work or energy into that. And it would be saying too, like there may be some effort being put in to heal the situation, right? Now here we have the Jack of Hearts. And so the first thing that I want to say besides the repetition in the suit here is that this particular card can represent news or messages pertaining to love, feelings, or relationships. So again, there's something about that kind of energy being repeated here. But again, this is a heads up again about maybe communication and forms of communications, right? For me, it's making me feel like how can we best express that we love people if we go with the idea that this card is mirroring the 8 of Hearts. And here we talked about this idea about mutual love and admiration. How can we best communicate that to other people this week? Or how can we best communicate that to people that we've had difficulties with, right? You know, it could be because the Jack is not facing these cards. It could be, would we be willing, if I can get the words out, to consider how can we get over whatever has been done in the past, right? Are we willing to put the work and effort into it? When I see a face card not looking in the direction of other cards, sometimes these 2 cards would suggest like whatever this issue is, the Jack is having difficulty with that, right? So there may be a struggle for someone in terms of putting in the work or the effort into improving a situation, right? They may not want to put in the work. They may not want to put in the effort. And if that's the case, going back to the very first card, it may be because they've done that in the past and they're not willing to do it, right? Because the Jack is not looking this way, right? So there may be about being willing to give a person, a loved one, or a very good friend, a second chance, right? The other thing with this card when it comes up for me, if we go with the idea of news and messages, hearts for me can represent something of a very spiritual nature. This is known as the mystical messenger card, right? So with that, mirroring the 8 of Hearts, remember I talked about this card representing the possibility of guardian angels and spirit guides, and this could be receiving news or messages or being in connection with your angels and your guides and receiving messages that way, right? It would be something of a spiritual or more mystical nature because this is known as the mystical messenger card. The last thing that I want to say about this card, again going with the spiritual element of the 7s, right? Remember now the 7 is a number of spirituality. For me, this card in particular is known as the Christ card, and it doesn't matter what your religious path or persuasion is, right? But as a symbolism for Christ, this card is known as making a sacrifice, right? So if we are going to have to consider the idea of giving somebody a second chance, and that having to do with improving a relationship with a very good friend or a loved one, there may be some sort of sacrifice we have to consider making. Again, playing on the idea that this was Christ, and Christ sacrificed himself, according to Christian scripture, sacrificed himself for the world, right? So as I'm saying that, it's making me feel like for some people, you have to be careful about sacrificing your own needs, emotional needs, for the expense or at the expense of somebody else. In that regard, it's making me feel like if you're in that place where you feel like you're sacrificing your needs for someone else, that may be wonderful at the beginning, but it could also be a situation where if you're not careful, some negative emotions could creep up, like anger, resentment, bitterness, that kind of thing, right? Because you are doing something at the expense of your own needs, right? So if you're going to give somebody else another chance and improve a relationship, this card is making me feel like it's important for you to understand that your needs are just as important, right? And so you want to be careful about not stepping into a situation where you are sacrificing your own needs for someone else's needs. Right, so that's what I want to say with the Jack of Hearts. So now it's very interesting. When I look at Jacks, I always look to the card that they are facing for additional information in terms of a news or message. So now let's take a look at the last card rounding out the line. And here we have, exactly what I just said. Okay, so now here we have a situation with the Three of Spades as the last card. So now we are moving into a space where there may be a problem or a challenge or a difficulty that we need to work through, because the suit of spades represents problems, challenges, and blocks, right? Now for me, my first go-to meaning with this card is that there's some sort of confusion or misunderstanding. So if there is something having to do with news or messages being communicated or expressed, either one or two things. Either the message itself is confusing and we don't understand it, or as a result of whatever is expressed, it's going to lead to some sort of confusion or misunderstanding. For me, this card would talk about a need to clear the air, right? It would suggest that if this situation is not resolved to some degree, it could potentially increase in terms of difficulty, because the 3 is a number of increase and expansion. And so sometimes for me, this card can represent a situation that grows worse, right? And so maybe we need to minimize that. How can we best minimize that, right? It could also be too, like if people are working on improving a relationship, and I'm looking at with the Eight of Hearts talking about something like on a one-to-one level, you know, either with a very good friend or a loved one, then this card is quite clear. The message that this card is delivering, with the Jack being the messenger card, and looking at this card, the message here is about not allowing other people to interfere in that. It's making me feel like there is a term on the street that be careful about bringing other people into a situation, because they're only going to bring confusion. Right, so this card could represent, because it's known as the interference by a third party card. So it could just be a matter of, if we are wanting to improve a situation and it involves ourselves and another person, it's very important to be mindful of who else you are bringing into the picture and who else you are sharing with what's going on, because they may be interfering. They may mean well, their intention may be in the right place, their heart may be in the right place, but be very careful, because that can only bring confusion and uncertainty about that, right? But it's making me feel like with this card here, we had possibly an argument, right? And we don't want that to linger and get worse, right? With the Jack being in between, right? So it could just be a matter of, if we have an argument, we may need to take a pause, because again, the Jack is not looking at this, and we may need to kind of re-examine or examine, because this card can represent tests and examinations. So we may need to either examine or re-examine the relationship itself, or that we may need to take a pause to consider what it is that we're going to say, because this card is known as the artist card. So for me, it can represent taking a creative approach to the situation, right? It could also be too, like if somebody is going to be expressing themselves, really come from a place of the heart, not the mind, right? So this could just be explaining how you feel or communicating how you feel rather than maybe what you think. Because here we have an interesting dichotomy. We have hearts represents our feelings, and then we have spades, which represents our mind. So it could just be a matter of, being really creative with how you're going to approach it, maybe with the words that you're going to use or how you're going to express yourself, right? But maybe make it more felt with the hearts, come from a more feeling place than a more maybe rational, logical, maybe cerebral approach, right? Because this card in the positive sense can represent creative thinking. If we go with the idea that spades represents thinking, then this would be creative thought, right? So I'm feeling like with this card, it's about putting some creative energy into it. But we want to take a look at the situation and not allow it to get any worse, right? Again, but it's making me feel like if this does resonate with you in terms of the one-to-one interaction, then if the interaction kind of blew up or became difficult one-to-one, it needs to be resolved on that level, because this card, again, is making me feel like don't bring a third party into it, because that may only add confusion to that. But it's making me feel like the important thing here is that there may be a misunderstanding that needs to get cleared up. So now I'm going to draw another card because I don't want to leave it on that note. So I'm going to take a moment to shuffle the cards. And I feel like I'm going to drop the cards, so let me do it this way. What I'm doing is I'm just going to pull a clarifying card to ask what more do we need to know about the final outcome card. All right. And again, I'm going to cut the cards. And now I'm going to fan them out. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can see a little bit of it. So now I'm just looking at the fan at this point, and I'm asking what card do I need to pick as the clarifying card. Seeing this card all the way here at the end, so I'm going to pick that and take these cards up. So I have the card I selected right here. Now we'll turn the card over. Yeah, ooh, look at this. Okay, so now here we have, as a clarifying card, we have the Ace of Hearts. So this is very good because the Ace of Hearts represents the beginning and start of a relationship, right? Or at the beginning of an emotional or spiritual experience. And this makes sense with the idea that we talked about with the very first card about, the second time around or a second chance. So it's making me feel like for some of us, there may be more an emphasis on a loved one with the dynamic that's being shown here, and about giving a loved one another chance. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the Ace of Hearts is also known as the home and family card. So there may be some situation that has to do with either A, our family, a family member, and that would make sense with a loved one, or that, a relationship partner, right? And again, that would be another type of loved one, right? So if it's not immediate family, it may be family that we have chosen to create, meaning like a boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, spouse, something of that nature. But it would be a situation that is having to do with home and family, or a situation that's close to home, right? So what I'm seeing here is that what may have to happen is that the expression here is like whenever I see a suit of hearts or a card from the suit of hearts following a spade card, there's emotional pain and hurt. So it's a matter of somebody needing to express the hurt that they've experienced in a particular relationship, either with a family member or someone who's like family, right? And needing to express that, right? But it's about clearing up some kind of confusion, misunderstanding. And if that happens, then this is about a beginning or a start, right? So the potential here is good if the communication and the expression of feelings is clear. That's the best way I could put it. If the expression of feelings and emotions are clear, then the potential here is very good. But again, it's making me feel like it has to do with something on the home front or something having to do with family. And so on that note, I will go ahead and wrap up this week's Oracle Outlook. I'm James Himm Mitchell, and as I close, I'd like to say thank you for sharing space here with me for this week's reading, and I look forward to sharing the same space with you again in our next reading together. So until then, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day, and I'm hoping that you have a wonderful week. Take care.